All right, well, welcome everybody. Thanks, Karen, for the introduction. And yeah, so I'm just going to spend 15, 20 minutes or so sharing with you the same presentation that I gave at our meeting in DC a few weeks ago. I was asked to talk about sort of future directions for consumer and food issues. And before starting, I guess I should say I was um, a little hesitant about embarking on this process of um, doing some strategic planning for the AAE. I know when Jill mentioned this at our board meeting last year, I thought, oh man, another strategic planning exercise. But actually I feel pretty good about the whole thing after being in DC and listening to what people have to say. I think we have well, I already knew that our profession was doing a lot of things, but I think this really can be a really good opportunity to describe what we do as a profession and to make sure that we're relevant in addressing some of the big issues of the day. So in any event, I hope we'll have a good outcome from this. So this will be something that we can use as a profession going forward. So in talking a little bit about the consumer and food issues, I thought it'd be useful to start with this quote. Probably most of you have all seen before by the bank robber Willie Sutton. A reporter once asked him, why do you rob banks? And he said, well, that's because that's where the money is. So when I think about this sort of issue for those of us that are food and agricultural economists, and I think about what do we want to be doing in the future, well, I think we don't want to rob banks, but we want to pay attention to what people are going to be interested in, not now, but in the future. And to the extent we're interested in funding and resources in the future, we need to pay attention to where the money is going to be for research and teaching and extension activities. So where is the public going to be in the future, and where is the money going to be in the future? So again, this is a graph that probably many of you have seen in one form or another, just showing the number of farms over time and the U.S. population over time. You know, before the 1940s or so, we had between 6 and 7 million farms. Today we have about 2 million, and all during that time period where we've been losing the number of farms, of course our population's been growing. And so if I do kind of a crude calculation and just calculate how many farms are there in the United States per person, you know, back a century ago, there were about 75 farms per 1,000 people. Today, there's only about 6 or 7. And so, the number is actually even a lot smaller than that when we look at the number of farms that actually account for any sizable output in the U.S. So, if I look at the USDA numbers correctly, I think there's about 160,000 farms that provide about 80% of the value of ag output. And so why does that matter? What does it mean? Well, we have a lot more people in the U.S. than we used to, but those people aren't nearly as connected to farming and farm-related activities as they used to. And it's not surprising, we can see it in our own profession, in our own journals, that there's a lot more interest in the consumer end of the food supply chain and what we're eating, how that food, what that food does for the food consumer, what we're paying for it, what qualities it has. And so I think we have seen that trend, we know it exists, but I think it's going to continue to be that way, that in terms of professional interest and importance, there's going to be more interest in the fork side of the equation perhaps than the farm side. If we look at where the money is, I found this data from the AAAS, and this is federal research spending by agency. The Department of Defense accounts for a huge percentage. Then you got NASA, Department of Energy, NSF, and then finally we have USDA after that. So, you know, ag research seems like it's a relatively small slice of the pie in the grand scheme of things. And one reaction might be, well, you know, what can we possibly that has anything to do with Department of Defense or NIH? No, actually, I think a lot more than we might initially think about. So on the defense side, there's a whole lot of hungry soldiers out there that need to eat. And I know of some colleagues that work in, for example, sensory sciences that work with the Department of Defense on you know, formulating food meals and rations. And so I don't think it's crazy to think that there isn't research that we can and perhaps should be doing that has some relevance there. And of course, on the side of the NIH, there's a lot of health issues in some of those related to food and dietary related diseases that we have a big role to play in. On the NASA side, I'm sure some of y'all saw the Martian movie where you had to figure out how to eat in space. So, I think there's things we can do on all of these different fronts outside perhaps of our traditional slice of the USDA. And again, when we think about the future, where future research funding is going to come from, is the USDA going to have a bigger or smaller budget for research in the future? That's a little hard to tell, but you can see there's bigger slices in some other agencies even there. If I sort of hone in a little more on research spending within the USDA, you can see it's kind of gone up and down a little bit over time, but the red bar there is the funding for the ERS, which is where a lot of our economic research is done, and the budget's been roughly around $80 million for the past several years, and hasn't changed a lot in that term, in those terms. So again, looking at a figure like this, as economists, if we want to go where the people are and where the money is, you can see there's some bigger chunks there, the ARS, and I guess we do play in the NIFA game a little bit, but there's a lot of other disciplines in there, and so it suggests to me that some multidisciplinary efforts are probably going to be the sorts of things that would be worthwhile to the extent that we're interested in going where the money is. So if you buy my argument that food and consumer issues are going to be increasing in importance in the future, what are the things that are going to matter? What are the things that we as a profession can weigh in on, and what are the things that consumers are going to worry about in the future? So this is a graph from a survey I do every month with a random sample of 1,000 people, and I've been doing this for over 3 years now. And in this survey, one of the things I ask the consumers to do is to do a little bit of a ranking and tell me, out of a list of 12 food issues, which is most important to you and which is least important to you, and I put them on a little index that goes between 1 and -1. And I put this up here just to show, what things are important to consumers, and there are 4 things. There's a little bit of variability over time, but you can see there's a huge gap there. The 4 things that are always the most important to food consumers are taste, safety, price, and the nutrition of food. And so I think, yeah, there's a lot of other issues there that we can find they're important if we ask surveys like animal welfare or environment or origin or convenience, but not nearly as important as those first 4. So again, thinking about things that are important to consumers now and are likely to be important in the future, it's affordable food, healthy, affordable food that tastes good. And all the other issues that we may be interested in and worry about are often important. So for example, take origin there. It's sort of a relatively low ranked thing, but of course you can find surveys and do research where people say origin is important, but my interpretation of that would be it's because sometimes people interpret origin as providing better taste or better safety or more affordability. So it's not the origin in and of itself, it's because it's a signal for these larger, more macro things that really, I think, are the fundamental things that are important to food consumers. I think looking forward, diet-related health issues are going to continue to be an important issue, and you all can see in the news and in politics as much as I do, the economics of those issues are increasingly important when people are talking about things like fat taxes and thin subsidies, sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, all these sorts of things, the costs of Medicare and Medicaid, and all these things are growing issues that will be with us for some time. The one thing I would say is they are big issues. Are they the issues of the future? I don't know about that. So for example, if you look at obesity, it's very high, rates are, and there's a lot of problems with that, but in terms of rates of increase, it's certainly not increasing at the rate it once was. And so trying to project out 20 years from now, what are going to be the big problems? Is it going to be obesity? Not sure about that. It's a big problem now. It may not be the thing 20 years from now, but almost certainly I think whatever it is, these diet and health related issues are going to be something that's important. I think there'll be increasing demand for quality, and I put that word in quotes because whatever that quality is likely to change over time. So whether it's organic or non-GMO or local or any number of other things, you know, I suspect that we'll see increasing demands for improvements in the food system, improvements in the quality of food. That happens both as consumers have more income, and still if you look at a graph, for example, of the share of disposable income spent on food in the U.S., it continues to decline, although that's also leveled off a little bit. But to the extent people have more disposable income, then they're going to typically demand higher quality out of their food system. I'd say that's also true not just in the U.S., but consumers in developing countries. We look at places like China and India that have very large populations that are growing in income. They're going to demand more other food systems from the retail end of that. And some of that is the third bullet point I had there, meat consumption issues, especially meat demand from developing countries is likely to grow, and what that does in terms of resource uses and the impacts of those are things I think we have an important role to play in addressing. I'd say on the domestic side of the meat consumption issue, there's been a whole lot of media and research reports sort of about meat consumption, whether it's environmental impacts or health impacts. I'm sure you've all seen the bacon causes cancer headlines, and we could debate the merits of those particular headlines, but the point there is that there seems to me to be a lot of discussion surrounding meat eating and meat consumption, and various policies related to that are likely to be with us in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. And then lastly, I'd say, is in terms of a sort of big picture issue related to food consumption issues, is food security. And the way I'd say it is just the issue that won't go away. And I've got a few slides here. They're probably things many of you are familiar with, but this is just an index of world food prices going back the last 30 years or so. And in the mid-2000s, food prices were historically at a low, been relatively low. People stopped worrying so much, it seemed, about these sort of Malthusian concerns. But then we had these big price spikes in 2008, again 2011 and 12, that caused a lot more concern about whether we really can produce enough food for a growing world population. And I think there's been some research recently relating some of these food price spikes to instability in parts of the Middle East and elsewhere. And so this is an old issue, but it's an issue that hasn't gone away, and if anything seems to be one that's increasing in importance. So if you look at other data from the United Nations, where they try to calculate the number of food insecure, hungry people in the world, they're at a number that's a little less than 1 billion. It's probably a little higher than this if you use different metrics. And the good news is it's kind of come down over time, but that's still a very large number. And of course, it's also still a problem even in the United States, a relatively wealthy country. This is USDA data on the prevalence of food insecurity in the U.S. And so, we're at a little more than 10% of the population before the Great Recession, and there was this big spike up, and we've sort of remained at a relatively high level since. Around 14 to 15% of the U.S. population is today food insecure. And so I think that's going to be still remains a big issue, and one that economists have a big role to play in analyzing the economic causes and consequences and effects of various policies in addressing those things. Sort of a last issue that I think is important in terms of a big issue of future concern is consumer knowledge of and aversion to productivity enhancing technologies. And the knowledge of side comes somewhat from that first graph I showed, where we can see that there are many fewer farms per person, and on average, the average food consumer today has less of a connection with sort of production agriculture. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In some ways, it's a really good thing that most people don't worry that much about where their food's coming from. They don't have to know that much about it. But sort of the downside of that, I think, is that there's a little bit of a lack of understanding sometimes about why farmers may be using certain technologies or certain production practices, and when people don't have the connection with people out in the fields using those technologies to check the things they're reading on the internet, that sometimes misperceptions can abound. And I think this is important because, I think as an economist, I think we can say that productivity growth is a really important issue, that if we want a more sustainable future, one where we have more stuff using less resources, that's going to require improvements in productivity. Improvements in productivity have all kinds of implications for food insecurity, which I already talked about, and also just sort of economic growth in general. So, if we want a more vibrant and a more productive production sector, that has to happen within a context of a consumer culture that's willing to accept those technologies. So I guess what I'm trying to say, not so many words, is that scientific progress isn't only a function of what's technologically feasible, but also what's socially acceptable. And so where our production scientists, our friends in the plant sciences and animal science departments, can create all kinds of great technologies, they're worthless if nobody is willing to adopt them. And I think this interface, especially for food economists, consumer economists, is a really important issue, and one that I think we can, play a role in helping understand some of this going forward. On this, my sort of premise that I think there's aversion to productivity enhancing technology, I'll show you just a couple of graphs from a nationwide survey I did a few months ago. In this survey, I asked the respondents this question you can see here, and I asked people to think about the future of food, and I said, in thinking about that, what are you most concerned about in terms of these various challenges? There's a whole list of things that people could choose, and I came up with this sort of relative ranking here based on what people chose. So you could see the most important challenge people thought was having affordable food for me and my family. The second one down was, the sort of health impacts, if you will, of the food eaten. The third is having enough food for a growing world. Then you see environmental impacts and all the rest. Okay, well, I asked this question, I was interested in what they said here, but I was mainly interested in how they answered the second question. And I said, okay, now that you've identified what you think is the most pressing food concern of the future, what do you think is the most effective way of addressing that challenge? And I gave people just two options. They could either choose that they thought the most effective way to meet that pressing concern they'd identified previously was to adopt a more technological production system, more innovation, science, research in crops and food, or to adopt a more natural agricultural production system, more local, more organic, unprocessed. And you can see the results here, but this is probably one of the more depressing results I think I've ever generated as somebody that, it works in an agricultural science college, generating a lot of these agricultural technologies. So, the vast majority, three-quarters of the consumers said that the most effective way forward is sort of a more naturalistic version. There's there's nothing wrong with those kind of production systems, and of course it doesn't have to be either or. I force the consumers into a choice here. But for those of us working in agricultural science fields, hopefully science and technology should play some role in addressing these important food problems. And so I think this is a big challenge for us going forward in thinking about how we tell the public what we're doing and how science and technology and those things are important in improving their lives, and what economists what role economists have to play in that process. Okay, so just the last few things I wanted to talk about is sort of move off of the discussion of food and consumer issues in particular, and just spend a couple of minutes talking about a general issue of what I hope we can get out of this project of thinking about priorities for agricultural and applied economists. So I just sat down and thought, what would I consider a success be from this exercise and from this report? So from my perspective, I think one of the things I'd really like to see from this report is something that clearly articulates what it is that we as economists bring to the table. What is our comparative advantage? What value do we add above the nutritionists, epidemiologists, agronomists, and all the other people that are doing good and fine work that's important, but maybe not quite the same thing that we do well. And so I think the most effective way to do this is to give concrete examples. So we can't just say, pat ourselves on the back and say, look at all this great work economists are doing, and we have some insights other people don't have. I think we've got to show it in concrete examples and in real ways of how we could take research that's been done in other disciplines and really make it better, yield new, better, different insights than would have come from it otherwise. So let me give you just a few examples of those. So for example, I think as economists, we're particularly well trained to think about policy impact analysis and the welfare economics. So yeah, if you're in nutrition or epidemiology, you might be able to calculate the number of, or estimate at least, the number of lives saved from some policy. But is it worth it? Does it create more benefits than costs? I think that's really the economic way of thinking about it, and something that we bring to the table to do, particularly when you think about welfare economics. We do that in a really integrated way, and I think in a way where we try to calculate not just the partial equilibrium effects, but the general equilibrium ones, all the effects and how they all add up, and that kind of analysis. And so I think this is something I think that's really important to policymakers. It's important in social discussions of these things, and it's really what we're trained to do. And so I think that is an important role that we should and can be playing in the future. I also think that as economists, just the way we're trained to think about problems is useful and beneficial. So I put up there marginal thinking and trade-offs. So in terms of marginal thinking, it's the question that we often want to answer isn't what happened, not what happens if we totally get rid of something, but if we improve a little bit on the margin. Or the sort of trade-off analysis, that the optimal amount of food waste, for example, isn't exactly zero, or the optimal number of dietary related heart attacks is not likely going to be zero, that there's some trade-off that's going to be implied there, and thinking about alternatives and consequences. So yeah, using glyphosate has some bad consequences, but what are the alternatives? If we ban that, what's the thing on the margin that'll be used, and is it any better or worse instead? I think those are the kinds of questions that economists that's the framing of the question I think that economists are particularly well suited to bring to the table. And lastly, I think here, one of the big things I think that we bring to the table is a real focus and aptitude on causal identification. And so, we've all seen crazy stories about how drinking red wine or eating chocolate is either going to give us cancer or make us live 10 years longer, or whatever the result this week happens to be. I think at least in the academic discourse and in the better journals and in the better seminars, it's probably hard to go in many seminars these days without somebody asking a question of, is that variable endogenous with this one? And that's just part of our training, and I think part of our more careful analysis really thinks about these issues in ways that lots of other disciplines either don't think about or aren't well trained to handle. And so I think this is something we really can bring to the table in terms of just methods of identifying whether policies or other variables or outcomes actually causally impact the outcomes of interest. So last two little things here that are things I think we as economists can bring to the table in these thinking about the future of where we position ourselves. One is the behavioral economics. So, sometimes I think it's not so much whether a policy passes a cost-benefit analysis, but what kind of policy. So, presuming at least that a policy is justified on some market failure ground, we might as well use the best consumer research we have to make it as effective as possible. So I'm thinking about things here, for example, like the work David Just is doing on smarter lunchrooms, or some of the other projects I know the ERS has funded using behavioral economics and even environmental policies. So, this, for those of us that do a lot of consumer research, I think a lot can be brought to the table in terms of helping make sure whatever policy is going to be implemented anyway be done so in a more effective manner. And I'm sure you've all read the stories about the new FDA nutrition that are out there, and whether changes in font size and where sugars are advertised, all those things are certainly the kinds of research we can and perhaps should be doing, and looking at impacts of those various policies. The last thing I'll say, and I think this is one thing that's probably underappreciated, perhaps even in our profession, and again, thinking about our production science colleagues, if you're a plant breeder and you create a new variety of wheat, for example, your economic impact is pretty easy to explain to people and to your administrator. You've made something and people bought it, and that creates this X dollars of revenue, and it's pretty clear what the impact of that is. But what are the impacts of doing a cost-benefit analysis? It's a little hard to say. So I'd say that in some ways it seems like we're sometimes at a disadvantage in that we don't really make anything. But the one thing we actually do make, I think, and are trained to at least think a little bit about, is to create markets and market design. So I've got just a few examples here, but for example, Al Roth has become well known for creating markets, and I use the word market there in quotation marks because some of his markets don't even involve prices, but for things like kidneys and schools. So this is literally life-saving matching here. So finding people who would like to donate a kidney and matching them up with people who have the right blood type and so forth, and the same with schools, so that people can actually get into the schools they want to get into and aren't trying to game the system. This is created by an economist that, again, has literally saved lives or helped people go to the schools they actually want to go to. Charlie Plott is an experimental economist, and he has done a lot of interesting research for a long career, but he came and gave a seminar here last year, I believe, and he talked about a market he created for the government of Australia, where he helped the federal government there auction off almost $1 billion in gaming rights across the country in a market that he designed and created to satisfy a whole bunch of social constraints and other issues that were important to the policymakers and other people in the country. We do have markets for things like CRP land, so people can bid on their land, and the fixed CRP dollars are allocated based on environmental characteristics of that land. And even at my own university here at Oklahoma State, there's a market. Actually, interestingly, I don't think this was even created by economists, but there's a Oklahoma litter market where poultry producers can advertise that they have poultry waste to sell, and then farmers on that same website can match up and say, hey, I'd like to buy that as fertilizer on my land. And I've even written about some things about, one potential way of solving some concerns about animal welfare is to create something like a market for animal welfare that would be perhaps analogous to pollution or a carbon market. The particular details of all these aren't as important as the overall idea that, whenever there are market failures or ill-defined property rights or externalities, or sometimes even imperfect competition, one potential answer to a lot of these problems is that there's a missing market, and we potentially have a role in creating something, that being a market where perhaps some of these things can get resolved a little better than they would be otherwise. So this is my last slide of a little shameless self-promotion of some issues I've written about in a couple recent popular books I've had come out. But hope this has encouraged a little bit of thinking about future consumer food issues, and I'll stop now and welcome any questions or comments you might have.